Some houses do not forget the people they lost. They simply grow colder while waiting for them to return. Lamp illuminated the man standing near the fireplace. Duke Adrian Ashbourne did not turn immediately. He remained still, one hand resting against the mantel as snow rattled softly against the tall windows behind him. Evelyn had heard whispers about the Duke even before arriving in Ravenmere County. Cold, reclusive, widowed before marriage, softly around her like something alive. Then she heard it. A piano. Slow notes drifting through the darkness below her room. Not elegant. Not polished. Broken. The kind of music that sounded as though someone were trying not to fall apart while playing it. Evelyn slipped from bed and followed the melody through the candlelit corridors. Past silent portraits. Past shuttered rooms untouched by warmth. Until she reached a half-open door at the end of the western hall. Inside, Duke Adrian Ashbourne sat alone at the piano beside a dying fire, shadows flickering across his face while the portrait of the dead woman watched from above him. His hands paused suddenly over the keys. Slowly, he lifted his eyes toward the doorway. And for the first time in years, someone had witnessed the grief he thought he buried alive. The music stopped, but the silence that followed felt even heavier. Evelyn remained frozen in the doorway as the final piano note faded into the shadows of the western wing. Duke Adrian Ashbourne sat motionless before the black grand piano, one hand still resting lightly against the keys while firelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face. For several endless seconds, neither of them spoke. The storm outside rattled the tall windows, sending faint tremors through the ancient glass. "You should not be here," he said at last, his voice quiet enough to blend with the wind. Evelyn lowered her eyes immediately. "I could not sleep, Your Grace. I heard the music." She expected anger, perhaps cold dismissal. Instead, Adrian turned his gaze back toward the fire as though he no longer possessed the strength to look at her directly. The room itself felt untouched by time. Heavy velvet curtains concealed the windows. Candles had burned nearly to the bottom of their holders. Dust lingered over bookshelves and dark furniture like the remains of forgotten years. Yet the piano gleamed perfectly beneath the candlelight, polished with obsessive care. Evelyn's attention drifted upward again before she could stop herself. The portrait of the woman above the fireplace seemed almost alive in the trembling gold light. Her pale gown shimmered softly. Her expression carried the sadness of someone already halfway gone. "Her name was Beatrice," Adrian said suddenly. Evelyn looked at him in surprise. His jaw tightened faintly, as though the words themselves wounded him. "You were told not to ask about her," he continued. "You did not ask." The fire cracked between them. Evelyn clasped her hands together to stop their trembling. "No, Your Grace." Adrian rose slowly from the piano bench. Tall shadows stretched behind him as he crossed the room toward the fireplace. He stared up at the portrait with the expression of a man standing beside a grave no one else could see. "Most people in this house pretend she never existed," he said quietly. "It is easier for them that way." Evelyn did not know what answer belonged in a room like this. She had spent years learning that grief could turn even kind people into strangers. After her father's death, silence had swallowed their little home in Connecticut inch by inch until every room felt haunted by the things no one could bear to say aloud. Some wounds did not heal. They simply learned how to hide beneath routine. "I do not think forgetting is easy for anyone," she whispered. Adrian's eyes shifted toward her then. Something unreadable flickered there. Not warmth. Not yet. But the sharp edge in his expression softened for one fragile moment before disappearing again. "You should rest, Miss Harper." His voice returned to formality like a door closing quietly between them. "Tomorrow will be demanding." Evelyn nodded and turned toward the hallway. Yet before she reached the door, Adrian spoke once more. "Clara does not speak to strangers." She paused. "I understand." "No," he said softly. "You do not." The words followed her through the dark corridors long after she returned upstairs. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of frozen steel. Snow still blanketed Ravenmere Hall in silence, while servants moved quietly through the corridors carrying silver trays and fresh coal for the fireplaces. Mrs. Holloway escorted Evelyn through the eastern wing shortly after breakfast. "Lady Clara spends most of her time in the conservatory," the housekeeper explained. "She prefers solitude." Evelyn glanced toward the towering windows overlooking the frozen gardens. "How old is she?" 8. Mrs. Holloway hesitated briefly. She has not been the same since her mother died. The conservatory doors opened softly before them. Warm light spilled across marble floors lined with winter roses and sleeping ivy. Near the far window sat a small girl in a pale blue dress, carefully arranging tiny porcelain animals across the floor. Golden curls fell over her shoulders while morning light illuminated her delicate profile. She looked so still she could have been carved from glass. "Lady Clara," Mrs. Holloway announced gently. "This is Miss Harper." The child did not answer. Her small hands continued adjusting the porcelain figures with quiet precision. Evelyn stepped closer slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile silence surrounding her. "Those are beautiful," she said softly. Clara finally looked up. Her gray eyes mirrored Adrian's exactly. Cold storms trapped inside a child too young to carry them. For one brief second, something almost like curiosity crossed her face before disappearing completely. Then, without a single word, she stood and walked away toward the far end of the conservatory, leaving the tiny porcelain deer lying alone beside Evelyn's feet. Mrs. Holloway sighed quietly once the child disappeared through the archway. Most governesses last less than 2 weeks. Evelyn bent down slowly and picked up the forgotten porcelain deer. Its tiny painted face stared back at her with silent fragility. Somewhere deep within Ravenmere Hall, a piano began playing again. Children who stop speaking are rarely born silent. Usually, the world simply gives them too much grief to carry. Snow continued falling over Ravenmere Hall for the next 3 days, sealing the estate beneath endless white silence while the wind moved through the iron gates with a low, mournful cry. Evelyn slowly began learning the rhythms of the manor. Breakfast arrived precisely at 7 each morning. Fires were lit before dawn in every occupied room. Servants walked softly through the corridors as though afraid to disturb the sorrow sleeping inside the walls. And every evening, somewhere deep, within the western wing, the piano played. Clara Ashbourne remained distant despite Evelyn's patient attempts to reach her. The child never argued, never misbehaved. Somehow, that made the silence surrounding her even more heartbreaking. She spent hours beside the conservatory windows arranging her porcelain animals into perfect little rows while snow gathered outside the glass in pale drifts nearly 2 feet high. Evelyn tried reading aloud to her during the afternoons. Stories about hidden gardens and summer oceans, and little girls brave enough to outrun storms. Clara listened quietly without interrupting, her expression unreadable beneath soft golden curls. But she never spoke. Not once. Late Thursday evening, Evelyn entered the nursery carrying fresh blankets when she found Clara sitting alone beside the fireplace long after bedtime. The child stared into the flames with hollow eyes far too old for someone only 8 years old. "You cannot sleep either?" Evelyn asked gently. Clara did not answer immediately. Then finally, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "The house is louder at night." Evelyn paused in surprise. It was the first time she had heard the child voluntarily speak. She knelt beside the chair slowly. "What does it say?" Clara's small fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket. "It remembers things." The fire crackled softly between them. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Before she could respond, Clara suddenly flinched, pressing one hand against her forehead. Her breathing became uneven. "Clara." Evelyn touched the child's cheek and immediately felt the heat burning beneath her skin. Panic tightened her chest. By midnight, the storm outside had worsened again, while Clara's fever climbed dangerously higher. Mrs. Holloway rushed to prepare cold cloths, while a servant rode through the snow to fetch the doctor from town, nearly 12 miles away. Evelyn remained beside the bed through every hour of the night, gently brushing damp curls away from Clara's flushed face, while candlelight trembled across the nursery walls. The child tossed restlessly beneath the blankets, trapped somewhere between sleep and fear. "Do not leave me," Clara whispered weakly at one point, her small hand clutching desperately at Evelyn's sleeve. Something inside Evelyn's chest broke quietly. "I am here," she promised softly. "I will not leave." Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally overtook her. She remained seated beside the bed with Clara curled against her side beneath layers of blankets, while the fire burned low in the hearth. Outside, snow continued falling against the windows in soft white waves. The nursery door opened quietly. Duke Adrian Ashbourne stepped inside, still dressed in yesterday's dark coat. traces of snow melting across his shoulders. His gray eyes moved instantly toward the bed. Clara slept peacefully at last, her fever finally beginning to break while Evelyn rested beside her, one protective arm wrapped gently around the child. Adrian stopped moving entirely. The room fell silent except for the faint crackle of dying firewood. For years he had avoided this nursery unless absolutely necessary. Too many ghosts lived there. Too many memories of laughter suddenly stolen away. Yet now, standing beneath weak morning light, he saw something he had not witnessed inside Ravenmere Hall since Beatrice died. Warmth. Not from the fire. From her. Evelyn's face looked softer in sleep, free from the careful restraint she carried while awake. One loose strand of chestnut hair rested across Clara's blanket, while the child unconsciously leaned closer against her side, as though she had finally found shelter after years spent cold. Adrian's chest tightened unexpectedly. Something unfamiliar moved through him. Dangerous. Human. Evelyn stirred slightly, then opened her eyes. For one startled second, neither of them spoke. Adrian remained standing near the doorway, tall and motionless beneath the fading shadows of dawn. His gaze had not left her. The fever is lower now, Evelyn whispered quietly, careful not to wake Clara. Adrian nodded once, though his expression remained unreadable. But he still did not look away. And somewhere deep within the silence of Ravenmere Hall, the frozen walls around his heart cracked for the very first time. The most dangerous moments are never loud. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary kindness. Clara's fever passed 2 days later, but something inside Ravenmere Hall had shifted with it. The servants noticed first. Fires were being lit earlier in the eastern wing. Fresh flowers appeared in the conservatory despite the brutal January cold outside. Even the endless silence hanging over the manor no longer felt quite as suffocating as before. Evelyn noticed the changes too, though she tried not to think too deeply about them. She focused instead on Clara, whose guarded walls had begun opening in tiny fragile ways. The child still spoke rarely, but now she allowed Evelyn to brush her hair each morning beside the nursery window while snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Sometimes Clara even listened while Evelyn read aloud from old novels near the fireplace in the afternoons. Small victories. Quiet ones. The kind easily missed by anyone not looking carefully. But Duke Adrian Ashbourne noticed everything. One evening, Evelyn entered the dining room expecting another solitary meal only to stop in surprise when she found Adrian already seated at the far end of the long oak table. Candlelight flickered across silver dishes and crystal glasses while snow pressed pale against the tall windows behind him. He glanced up briefly as she entered. "Miss Harper," he said calmly. "Your Grace." Evelyn hesitated beside the doorway, uncertain whether she should leave. Adrian set down the document he had been reading. "Sit." The single word startled her more than it should have. For the first week of her stay, meals had always been sent separately to her room. The Duke rarely dined with anyone. Mrs. Holloway herself had admitted the dining hall had remained mostly empty for years. Evelyn slowly took her seat nearly 12 feet away from him at the opposite end of the enormous table. The silence between them stretched softly while servants poured tea and quietly disappeared again. Adrian cut into his dinner with precise, controlled movements. Yet several times during the meal, Evelyn caught him looking toward her as though trying to solve something he did not fully understand. "Clara ate breakfast this morning," he said eventually. Evelyn looked up in surprise. She said the jam tasted too sweet. The faintest shadow of amusement crossed Adrian's face before disappearing. "That is the most she has complained in months." Evelyn smiled before she could stop herself. "I suppose that is progress." Adrian stared at her smile for 1 second too long. Then he looked away toward the fire. Something tightened invisibly in the room. Dangerous not because of what was spoken, because of what was not. Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked with Clara through the western corridor while snowlight filtered faintly across the marble floors. The child carried one of her porcelain deer carefully against her chest, while Evelyn held a stack of books gathered from the library. As they approached the grand staircase, Clara suddenly stopped walking. "He watches you now," she whispered quietly. Evelyn blinked in confusion. "Who?" Clara looked upward toward the second-floor balcony. Adrian stood there partially concealed by shadows, one hand resting against the carved railing while his gray eyes followed them silently below. He had likely been there for several minutes unnoticed. Their gazes met briefly across the distance. Something warm and unsettling passed through Evelyn's chest before she lowered her eyes quickly. Clara continued climbing the stairs ahead of her, but halfway upward, Evelyn's boots slipped against the polished stone. The books tilted dangerously from her arms. Before she could fall, a strong hand closed firmly around her wrist. Adrian had descended the staircase without her hearing him. His grip remained steady against her skin while the scattered books slid harmlessly against the steps below them. Evelyn's breath caught softly. They stood far too close. Close enough for her to notice faint silver near his temples. Close enough to catch the scent of cedarwood and winter clinging to his coat. Adrian looked down at her with unreadable intensity, his hand still wrapped around her wrist several seconds longer than necessary. "These stairs become dangerous during storms," he said quietly. Evelyn swallowed carefully. "Thank you, Your Grace." But Adrian did not immediately release her. His eyes lingered on her face as though something there unsettled him, something he had spent years trying not to feel. Then suddenly Clara's small voice echoed softly from above them. She almost fell. Adrian's expression shifted instantly. His grip loosened at once. Distance returned like a locked door. "See that the carpets are replaced on these steps," he instructed a nearby servant coldly before turning away. Evelyn watched him disappear down the corridor beneath trembling candlelight, while her pulse refused to steady completely. And somewhere far above the frozen grounds of Ravenmere Hall, the old grandfather clock began striking midnight, even though the sun had not yet set. Some people survive heartbreak by burying the past. Others preserve it so carefully that they become buried beside it. February arrived wrapped in endless gray skies and bitter winds that swept across Ravenmere Hall with restless force. The snow outside had begun hardening into thick layers of ice along the stone terraces, while the gardens beneath the windows slept beneath winter's cold grip. Yet inside the manor, subtle warmth continued spreading room by room, like candlelight fighting against darkness. Clara now waited for Evelyn every morning beside the conservatory doors with one of her little porcelain animals hidden carefully in her hands. Sometimes she even smiled. Small smiles. Fragile ones. But enough to make the servants exchange startled glances whenever they passed. Even Mrs. Holloway seemed lighter these days. "I had forgotten this house could sound alive," she admitted quietly one afternoon while arranging fresh linens in the nursery. Evelyn looked up from Clara's lessons. Ravenmere was not always like this. The housekeeper paused briefly beside the window. "No," her voice softened with memory. "Before Miss Beatrice died, there was music everywhere. Flowers in every room. His Grace used to host winter balls so beautiful that guests traveled from Boston and New York just to see the manor lit at Christmas." Evelyn listened quietly while Clara continued sketching at the little writing desk nearby. "And after?" Mrs. Holloway's expression dimmed. "Afterward, the lights went out. That evening, snow began, falling again shortly before sunset. Adrian remained in his study while the storm deepened beyond the windows, reviewing estate accounts beneath low firelight. Yet despite the papers spread before him, his thoughts drifted repeatedly toward the sound of Evelyn's laughter echoing faintly upstairs earlier that afternoon. He had heard Clara laugh with her. Actual laughter. The sound had stopped him cold in the corridor outside the nursery because for one impossible second, it felt like the past breathing again inside Ravenmere Hall. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Dangerous. That was what this had become. Dangerous in ways no storm could compare to. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." Evelyn stepped quietly into the study carrying a silver tea tray. Candlelight shimmered softly against her chestnut hair, while the fire painted warm gold across her pale blue dress. Adrian looked up automatically and forgot the document in his hands entirely. "Mrs. Holloway said you had not eaten since breakfast," Evelyn said gently while placing the tray near the fireplace. She worried. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair. "Mrs. Holloway worries professionally." A faint smile touched Evelyn's lips before disappearing again. "Still, you should eat something." Adrian watched her pour tea with calm, steady hands. Strange how naturally she belonged here now, as though the manor itself had quietly reshaped around her presence. "Clara asked about her mother today," Evelyn said softly after a moment. The air shifted instantly. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you tell her?" "That grief does not disappear simply because people stop speaking about it. Silence followed. Heavy. Careful. Adrian stared into the fire while shadows flickered across his face. Beatrice loved winter, he said unexpectedly. Evelyn looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had spoken her name willingly since that night in the music room. Everyone else complained about the snow. Adrian continued quietly. But she used to walk through the gardens during storms without a coat because she said the cold made her feel awake. His expression softened with distant pain. She could make an entire room feel brighter simply by entering it. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Some grief deserved witness more than answers. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around his untouched glass. The wedding was supposed to happen in December. The fire cracked softly beside them. But she became ill 2 weeks before Christmas. His voice remained controlled. Too controlled. Like someone holding together shattered glass with bare hands. After she died, I closed half the manor because every room reminded me of her. Evelyn's chest ached quietly at the loneliness hidden beneath his calm voice. And the piano? Adrian gave a humorless smile that vanished almost immediately. That was hers too. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows while candlelight trembled across the dark study walls. Then Evelyn noticed something tucked partially beneath a stack of papers near the edge of his desk. A folded piece of ivory fabric. Delicate lace trimming one corner. Adrian followed her gaze instantly. His entire expression hardened. He reached for the fabric immediately, folding it away with almost painful precision. You should return upstairs, Miss Harper. Distance flooded back into his voice so suddenly it felt like winter returning after false spring. Evelyn stood quietly. Of course, Your Grace. But as she reached the doorway, she heard him speak again without looking up. It was part of her wedding veil. Evelyn paused only briefly before leaving the study in silence. Behind her, Adrian remained seated alone beside the fire with the folded lace clenched tightly in his hand, while snow continued falling over Ravenmere Hall like grief refusing to let go. There are rooms inside every grieving heart that remain locked for years. And sometimes love arrives by accident holding the key. The storm began shortly after midnight. Wind slammed violently against Ravenmere Hall, while snow swirled across the grounds in furious white waves that nearly erased the iron gates from sight. Candles flickered throughout the manor as servants hurried to secure shutters against the worsening weather. Evelyn woke suddenly to the sound of distant crashing somewhere deep within the western wing. For several confused seconds, she remained still beneath the blankets listening to the storm roar through the old corridors. Then came another sound. A door striking repeatedly against a wall somewhere downstairs. She quickly pulled on her robe and stepped into the hallway where cold air drifted through the manor like icy breath. Several candles had already extinguished themselves, leaving long stretches of darkness between trembling pools of golden light. The noise echoed again from the far western corridor. Evelyn followed it carefully, one hand trailing lightly along the stone wall while the storm shook the windows overhead. The western wing always felt colder than the rest of Ravenmere Hall. Forgotten somehow, as though grief itself lingered there stronger than anywhere else in the house. When Evelyn reached the end of the corridor, she froze. One of the great double doors stood partially open beneath flickering candlelight, moving slightly each time the wind swept through the cracked windows nearby. She recognized the door immediately. No servants ever entered this section of the manor. Mrs. Holloway herself had once whispered that the room beyond had remained sealed since Beatrice died. Evelyn should have walked away. Every instinct told her to leave the door untouched. But something about the loneliness hanging inside that dark opening pulled at her quietly. Gently she pushed the door wider. The room beyond felt untouched by time. Moonlight spilled faintly through tall windows draped in ivory curtains, while candle holders sat frozen beneath layers of dust. A delicate wedding gown rested upon a mannequin near the fireplace, pale silk glowing softly within the darkness like a ghost waiting faithfully for someone who would never return. Evelyn stepped farther inside, her breath catching at the sight around her. Fresh flowers no longer filled the room, yet traces of dried lavender still lingered faintly in the air. Jewelry remained scattered across the vanity exactly where it had been left years ago. A pair of satin gloves rested carefully folded beside several unopened letters tied with silver ribbon. The entire room looked less like abandoned space and more like preserved heartbreak. Evelyn moved slowly toward the fireplace where framed sketches stood arranged beside melted candles. One drawing showed Beatrice smiling beside Adrian beneath summer sunlight. Younger, unburdened, alive in ways she could no longer imagine him being now. Her chest tightened painfully. "You should not be here." Adrian's voice shattered the silence behind her. Evelyn turned instantly. He stood motionless in the doorway, still dressed in black trousers and a white shirt hastily buttoned beneath a dark coat. Snow clung to his shoulders from outside, while shadows carved sharp exhaustion beneath his eyes. But it was the look on his face that made Evelyn's heart falter. Not anger, devastation, raw and terrible. The storm opened the door. Evelyn whispered softly. "I heard it from upstairs, and I only wanted to close it." Adrian crossed the room slowly, every movement rigid with restraint. "This room stays locked." His voice sounded dangerously controlled. "I know. I am sorry." But Adrian was no longer listening. His gray eyes had fixed on the wedding gown near the fire. Something inside him seemed to collapse quietly at the sight. He moved toward it almost unconsciously before stopping several feet away, as though he could not bear getting closer. "She chose that dress herself," he said suddenly. The storm thundered outside the windows. "She spent 3 months changing the lace because she said the original sleeves looked too severe." His voice cracked faintly on the final word. Evelyn's breath caught softly. Adrian pressed one trembling hand against the edge of the mantel. "I told myself locking this room away would stop the memories." A bitter smile touched his face for only a second. "Instead, I simply trapped myself inside them." Evelyn had never seen him like this before. The cold Duke feared across half the county stood before her, looking unbearably human beneath the candlelight. Lonely in ways words could never fully reach. "Your Grace," she whispered carefully. Adrian shook his head once. "I loved her." The confession came quietly. "Broken. And when she died, I buried everything else with her because it hurt less than surviving without her." Silence trembled heavily between them. Then suddenly Adrian looked at Evelyn fully for the first time that night. His eyes glistened faintly in the firelight, while years of grief stood exposed between them with nowhere left to hide. "But lately," he said hoarsely, "this house has begun breathing again." Evelyn's chest tightened painfully at the sound of those words. Adrian stared at her another long, fragile second before turning away abruptly, as though the truth itself terrified him. Outside, the storm raged harder against Ravenmere Hall, while somewhere deep within the locked room of the dead woman, a frozen heart finally began breaking open. The cruelest thing about belonging somewhere is realizing how much it will hurt when you are forced to leave. The morning after the storm, Ravenmere Hall stood wrapped beneath pale, silver sunlight that reflected sharply against the endless snow surrounding the estate. Yet despite the calm outside, Evelyn could still feel the weight of the previous night lingering through the manor corridors like the final notes of unfinished music. She had not stopped thinking about Adrian standing inside that frozen room of memories with grief exposed openly across his face for the first time. Nor had she forgotten the quiet confession that escaped him beside the fire. "This house has begun breathing again." The words haunted her more than they should have, because somewhere deep inside herself, Evelyn had begun feeling it too. Clara spent the morning unusually cheerful, carefully arranging fresh winter roses into tiny crystal vases while humming softly beneath her breath. The sound startled every servant who passed through the conservatory. Mrs. Holloway nearly dropped an entire tray of teacups when she heard it. "I have not heard Lady Clara sing since she was 5 years old," the housekeeper whispered quietly to Evelyn later that afternoon. Evelyn smiled faintly, but her chest tightened at the same time. Temporary things were not supposed to matter this much. Temporary people were not supposed to leave pieces of themselves behind. That evening, while snow drifted lazily beyond the windows, Evelyn sat alone in her room, staring at the letter spread open across her lap. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers. It had arrived from Boston earlier that morning. A small teaching position had become available at a boarding school nearly 300 miles away. Permanent work. Safe work. Predictable. The kind of future she had promised herself she would choose if it ever appeared. Yet the thought of leaving Ravenmere Hall suddenly felt unbearable in ways she could not explain. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara peeked shyly through the doorway, clutching one of her porcelain deer against her chest. "Miss Harper." Evelyn quickly folded the letter closed. Yes. Clara stepped inside slowly. Will you read tonight? The child's gray eyes carried something fragile inside them now. Hope. Evelyn swallowed quietly. Of course. But later, long after Clara had fallen asleep beside the nursery fire, Evelyn returned alone to her room carrying the folded letter like a secret wound against her chest. She knew what staying here risked. Adrian Ashbourne remained a grieving duke still chained to the memory of another woman. And she was only temporary. Nothing more. The words echoed painfully now because she no longer believed them herself. The next morning, the storm returned without warning. Fierce winds swept violently across the estate, while snow swallowed the roads leading away from Ravenmere Hall. By noon, the servants had begun securing windows once more while Adrian remained occupied with urgent matters concerning damaged tenant properties nearby. Evelyn watched the worsening weather from the library window with growing unease. The letter from Boston remained hidden inside her coat pocket. By evening, she had made her decision. It would be easier to leave now before the fragile warmth growing between them destroyed what little safety remained in her heart. She packed quietly after dinner while the storm raged louder outside. Only a small suitcase, a few dresses, her father's old pocket Bible. Nothing else had ever truly belonged to her anyway. Mrs. Holloway protested softly when Evelyn explained she intended to leave before dawn. The roads are dangerous tonight, the housekeeper warned anxiously. Please wait until the storm passes. Evelyn forced a faint smile. If I stay longer, it will become harder to go. The older woman studied her carefully, then sighed with heartbreaking understanding. Shortly after midnight, Evelyn slipped quietly through the entrance hall, wearing her heavy wool coat, while snow lashed furiously against the front doors. She had nearly reached the waiting carriage outside when a deep voice cut sharply through the storm behind her. Where are you going? Evelyn froze instantly. Adrian stood at the top of the stone steps bareheaded beneath the falling snow, his dark coat whipping violently in the wind, while disbelief hardened every line of his face. Neither of them moved for several endless seconds. Then Adrian descended the steps quickly toward her, snow crunching beneath his boots. Answer me. Evelyn tightened trembling fingers around her suitcase handle. I received another position in Boston. Adrian stared at her as though the words themselves made no sense. You are leaving? It was always temporary. Pain flickered visibly across his expression before he masked it again. The storm roared around them while snow collected across Evelyn's coat and Adrian's dark hair. The roads are nearly impassable, he said tightly. You cannot travel tonight. I have to. Adrian stepped closer then. Too close. Close enough for Evelyn to see the fear hidden beneath his controlled expression. No, he said quietly. You do not. His gloved hand closed suddenly around her wrist with desperate firmness. Warm despite the freezing storm. You are not leaving Ravenmere. And for the first time since she arrived at the manor, the cold duke sounded less like a man giving orders and more like someone terrified of being abandoned all over again. A heart does not panic when something meaningless disappears. It only breaks when losing the one thing it secretly cannot survive without. Snow buried the carriage tracks by morning. The storm had grown too violent for anyone to leave Ravenmere Hall safely, and despite Evelyn's quiet protests, Adrian ordered the gates sealed until the roads cleared again. He did not raise his voice. Somehow that made the command feel even more absolute. Evelyn remained in her room for most of the next day, unable to quiet the storm now raging inside her chest. She could still feel Adrian's hand around her wrist beneath the snowfall. You are not leaving Ravenmere. The words followed her through every corridor like a heartbeat she could not silence. Downstairs, the manor no longer resembled the frozen mausoleum she had first entered weeks earlier. Fires burned brighter. Servants spoke more freely. Even the heavy curtains in several drawing rooms had finally been opened to allow winter sunlight inside. It was subtle, quiet, yet undeniable. Ravenmere Hall had begun waking from grief, and everyone knew why. His Grace asked whether Miss Harper preferred honey in her tea this morning. One maid whispered softly in the kitchen. The Duke? Another servant nearly gasped. He noticed her tea? Mrs. Holloway pretended not to hear them, though a knowing smile briefly touched her face before disappearing again. Adrian himself seemed unaware that his behavior had changed so visibly, or perhaps he simply no longer cared. During dinner that evening, He moved Evelyn's chair closer to the fireplace before she entered the room because he remembered she disliked drafts near the windows. When Clara mentioned wanting fresh strawberries despite the middle of winter, Adrian immediately instructed a servant to send riders into town searching for them by morning because Evelyn casually mentioned Clara had barely eaten all week. Small things. But in Ravenmere Hall, small things felt enormous. Evelyn noticed every one of them. That frightened her more than anything. Late the following afternoon, several neighboring landowners arrived unexpectedly at the manor after becoming stranded by the storm. The grand drawing room filled with candlelight, expensive coats, and polite conversation for the first time in years. Evelyn remained near the windows beside Clara while the guests spoke quietly around the fire. She felt painfully out of place among them. Too ordinary. Too temporary. Then Lady Margaret Winthrop entered the room draped in dark velvet and diamonds that glittered beneath the chandeliers. Her sharp eyes moved immediately toward Evelyn with open curiosity. "And who might this be?" she asked smoothly. Before Evelyn could answer, Adrian looked up from across the room. "Miss Evelyn Harper," he said calmly. "She is under my protection." Silence followed instantly. Several guests exchanged subtle glances over their wine glasses. Lady Margaret's perfectly shaped brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "How unusual," she murmured. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "Not at all." Evelyn's pulse stumbled painfully. "Under my protection." The words settled somewhere dangerous inside her heart. Later that evening, while snow pressed softly against the windows and guests gathered near the fire, Clara climbed quietly into Evelyn's lap, with her porcelain deer held tightly against her chest. The child rested her head against Evelyn's shoulder with complete trust. No hesitation. No fear. Adrian watched the scene from beside the fireplace without realizing everyone else could see him too. The way his entire expression softened whenever he looked at Evelyn. The way his eyes followed her unconsciously through every room. The way Ravenmere itself seemed to breathe easier around her. Mrs. Holloway approached Evelyn quietly while the others remained distracted by conversation. "I have worked for His Grace since he was 19 years old," the housekeeper whispered softly. "I watched grief hollow him until there was almost nothing left." Evelyn lowered her eyes carefully. "Mrs. Holloway." But the older woman gently touched her arm. "The Duke breathes differently when you enter a room now." Evelyn's chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. Across the drawing room, Adrian looked toward her at that exact moment, as though he had somehow felt the conversation from across the distance. Firelight flickered across his face while snow drifted endlessly beyond the dark windows behind him. Neither of them looked away. And somewhere deep beneath the quiet warmth filling Ravenmere Hall, something dangerous continued growing between them. Something neither of them knew how to stop anymore. Sometimes the heart breaks not because love was impossible, but because it was never promised to stay. The storm finally loosened its grip on Ravenmere Hall 3 days later. Pale sunlight stretched across the frozen grounds while servants hurried outside to clear snow from the carriage paths buried beneath nearly 3 feet of ice and drifting white powder. Yet inside the manor, warmth lingered stubbornly in every room Evelyn entered. Clara now followed her constantly through the halls carrying books or little porcelain animals tucked beneath her arm. Even the servants smiled more openly these days, no longer lowering their voices whenever Adrian passed through the corridors. Ravenmere Hall had changed. The terrifying truth was that Evelyn had changed with it. That morning, while organizing lesson books inside the library, Evelyn climbed a small ladder near the upper shelves searching for Clara's geography text. Dust floated softly through golden winter light pouring from the tall windows, while silence wrapped peacefully around the room. Then one loose stack of ledgers shifted suddenly from the shelf above her. Evelyn startled backward, losing her balance. Before she could fall, strong hands steadied her firmly around her waist. "Careful!" Adrian's voice sounded directly behind her. Evelyn's breath caught instantly. For one dangerous second, neither of them moved. Adrian still held her gently while the fallen papers scattered uselessly across the carpet below. Close. Far too close. Evelyn could feel the warmth of him through the layers of fabric between them. "I am sorry," she whispered softly. Adrian looked at her for several long moments before slowly helping her down from the ladder. His hands lingered at her waist 1 second longer than necessary. "You should not climb these shelves alone," he said quietly. But his voice no longer sounded cold. It sounded tired. Human. Evelyn lowered her eyes quickly. I only wanted to find Clara's books. Adrian bent to retrieve the fallen papers from the floor before suddenly pausing. One document had slipped partially free from the leather folder, now resting near his polished shoes. Evelyn recognized the elegant signature at the bottom instantly. Her own name stared back at her from the page. Miss Evelyn Harper. Temporary winter governess appointment. Seasonal replacement only. Compensation through March 15th. The words struck her chest like ice water. Seasonal replacement only. Adrian's expression shifted the moment he realized what she had seen. He reached for the contract immediately, folding the paper closed with controlled precision. But it was already too late. Evelyn finally understood the truth she had spent weeks trying not to face. No matter how warm Ravenmere Hall had become, no matter how differently Adrian looked at her now, she had still arrived here as something temporary. A placeholder inside another woman's ghost. Adrian stood slowly. Miss Harper, you do not need to explain. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. The arrangement was always clear. Something painful flickered across his face. Evelyn. The use of her first name nearly shattered her composure completely. He had never spoken it like that before. Quietly, carefully, as though the name itself mattered to him. Evelyn stepped backward before he could come closer. I should return to Clara's lessons. Adrian's jaw tightened faintly. You are upset. No. She forced a faint smile that hurt to hold together. Only foolish. Silence filled the library. Heavy. Unsteady. Adrian took one step toward her, then stopped as though uncertain what he was even allowed to say anymore. Because perhaps he finally understood the cruelest part of all this too. He had taught her to feel at home inside Ravenmere Hall, without ever telling her she was allowed to stay. That evening, Evelyn remained unusually quiet during dinner, while Clara sensed the tension immediately beneath the polite silence filling the long table. Adrian barely touched his meal. Several times his gaze lifted toward Evelyn as though searching desperately for words neither of them knew how to speak aloud. But the distance between them had returned now. Invisible. Sharp. Painful. After dinner, Evelyn escaped upstairs as quickly as propriety allowed. She stood alone beside the nursery window staring out across the frozen gardens while moonlight silvered the snow beneath the dark sky. Temporary. The word echoed mercilessly inside her chest now. A soft knock sounded behind her. Clara stepped quietly into the room, clutching her porcelain deer against her chest. Miss Harper. Evelyn quickly brushed away the tears threatening her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. Clara hesitated briefly before speaking in the smallest voice imaginable. You are not leaving too, are you? Evelyn's heart cracked, so painfully she could barely breathe. Before she could answer, carriage wheels echoed faintly from the courtyard below. Both of them turned instinctively toward the window. A sleek black carriage had just arrived through the iron gates beneath the pale moonlight. Servants hurried toward it immediately, while Adrian himself appeared moments later crossing the snowy courtyard below. Clara pressed closer to the glass beside Evelyn. Who was that? The carriage door opened slowly. A tall, elegant woman stepped out draped in silver fur and dark velvet, her beauty striking even beneath the storm lanterns flickering around her. She smiled the moment Adrian approached her. And for the first time since arriving at Ravenmere Hall, Evelyn felt something inside her heart truly begin to break. The world always remembers the difference between a woman who belongs in a castle and one who was only invited inside it temporarily. Her name was Lady Rosalind Fairfax. Evelyn learned it the following morning from whispered conversations drifting through the corridors before breakfast. By the time she entered the dining room, the entire manor already seemed to move differently around the elegant stranger now seated beside the fire. Lady Rosalind wore deep emerald silk that shimmered softly beneath the chandeliers while diamonds glimmered at her throat like frost beneath candlelight. She looked exactly like the kind of woman Ravenmere Hall should have welcomed all along. Refined, wealthy, beautiful in the polished, effortless way society admired. Evelyn immediately understood why her arrival unsettled something deep inside her chest. Rosalind belonged to Adrian's world. She always had. Miss Harper, Rosalind greeted smoothly as Evelyn entered. I have heard quite a lot about you already. Evelyn forced herself to smile politely. Lady Rosalind. Adrian looked up from the table at that exact moment. His gray eyes lingered briefly on Evelyn's face as though searching for something there before he quietly rose from his chair. "Please sit," he said softly. Evelyn noticed immediately that Rosalind was seated beside Adrian's usual place at breakfast. Close enough for familiar conversation. Close enough for old history. Clara remained unusually quiet throughout the meal, pushing food around her plate while watching Rosalind carefully beneath lowered lashes. The child finally spoke only once. "Miss Harper reads to me after supper." Rosalind smiled pleasantly. "How lovely." Then she turned toward Adrian. "You truly have transformed this house. I hardly recognized Ravenmere when we arrived last night." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. Time changes many things. Rosalind's eyes flickered knowingly toward him. Sometimes not enough. Evelyn lowered her gaze quickly to her untouched tea. She suddenly felt painfully aware of every difference between herself and the woman seated across the table. Rosalind understood society dinners and ballroom politics and inherited wealth. Evelyn understood survival, temporary positions, leaving quietly before becoming inconvenient. The contrast humiliated her more than she wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, while Clara worked quietly on her lessons near the conservatory windows, Evelyn overheard voices drifting from the adjoining drawing room. She had not meant to listen, but Adrian's name stopped her instantly. "You cannot remain alone forever," Lady Margaret Winthrop said firmly somewhere beyond the doorway. "The county already expects an announcement regarding you and Lady Rosalind before spring." Silence followed briefly before Adrian answered in a lower voice Evelyn could barely hear. "Rosalind deserves honesty." "What she deserves," Lady Margaret interrupted sharply, "is the future she has waited 5 years for. And Ravenmere deserves a duchess again." Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. She should have walked away immediately. Instead, she remained frozen beside the bookshelves while her pulse pounded unevenly beneath her ribs. Then Adrian spoke again, quietly, tiredly. "A duke cannot build his life around desire alone." The words struck harder than they should have, because suddenly Evelyn understood. Whatever existed between them inside these quiet halls meant nothing against the expectations of Adrian's world. Men like him married women like Rosalind. Women born into wealth and perfect bloodlines and grand ballrooms glowing beneath chandeliers. Not governesses hired temporarily through winter contracts. Clara looked up from her lessons moments later, immediately noticing something had changed in Evelyn's face. "Are you sick?" the child asked softly. Evelyn forced a smile that trembled slightly at the edges. "No, sweetheart." But her voice sounded far away even to herself. That evening, Ravenmere Hall hosted a formal dinner for neighboring families stranded nearby after the storm. Candlelight illuminated the grand dining room, while polished silver and crystal reflected warm gold across the long table. Evelyn sat farther down among the guests while Rosalind occupied the seat beside Adrian throughout the entire evening. Every time someone addressed them together, society already treated them as though the future had quietly arranged itself. Clara barely spoke during dinner. Neither did Evelyn. At one point, Adrian's eyes lifted across the table toward her unexpectedly. Concern flickered briefly across his expression when he noticed how pale she looked beneath the candlelight. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, "you have barely eaten." Every conversation around the table softened instantly. Evelyn felt Rosalind's gaze settle upon her with elegant curiosity. "I am simply tired, Your Grace." Adrian continued watching her for several seconds longer than propriety allowed. Dangerous seconds. Intimate ones. Rosalind noticed it too. Everyone did. The silence stretching between them carried too much feeling now to remain invisible. Adrian finally looked away first, but the damage had already been done. Later that night, long after the guests retired upstairs, Evelyn stood alone in the dark conservatory, staring out across the frozen gardens while moonlight silvered the snow. Behind her, footsteps approached softly against the marble floor. Adrian stopped several feet away. "You avoided me all evening," he said quietly. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the glass. "I thought it best." Silence trembled between them. Adrian stepped closer slowly. "Best for whom?" Evelyn finally turned toward him then, her composure cracking painfully beneath the weight of everything left unsaid. "For the Duke who must think beyond desire." Adrian went completely still, and for the first time since she arrived at Ravenmere Hall, Evelyn saw genuine fear enter his eyes. The saddest goodbyes are the ones spoken quietly while the other person still believes there is time left. Adrian did not answer her immediately. The moonlight spilling through the conservatory windows painted pale silver across his face, while snow drifted silently beyond the frozen gardens outside. For several long seconds, he simply looked at Evelyn as though the words she had spoken had reached somewhere deep inside him that he no longer knew how to protect. "You heard that conversation," he said quietly at last. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I heard enough." Adrian stepped closer slowly. "Evelyn." The way he said her name now made it impossible to breathe normally around him anymore. "What you heard was not. Please." Her voice cracked softly before she steadied it again. "You do not owe me explanations, Your Grace." Pain flickered visibly across his expression. Real pain. But Evelyn could not survive hearing kindness from him now. Not when she finally understood the truth. Ravenmere Hall had never truly been hers to belong to. Adrian Ashbourne had simply forgotten for a little while that she was temporary. "You should marry Lady Rosalind," Evelyn whispered. The words nearly destroyed her as they left her mouth. Adrian stared at her as though she had struck him. "Do not say that. It is true." Her eyes glistened beneath the weak moonlight now despite every effort to remain composed. "She belongs beside you. Everyone can see it." Adrian's jaw tightened sharply. "And what do you see?" Evelyn looked away before he could witness how completely her heart had already betrayed her. "I see a duke who deserves a future untouched by scandal." Silence collapsed heavily between them. Then Adrian reached for her hand suddenly, almost desperately, his fingers warm against hers in the cold conservatory air. "You think this is about scandal?" His voice dropped lower, rougher. "You think I care what society says anymore?" Evelyn's pulse stumbled painfully, because she wanted to believe him. God help her. She wanted to believe every impossible thing hidden inside his eyes when he looked at her like this. But grief had already taught her once what happened when fragile hopes were trusted too deeply. She gently pulled her hand free. "Good night, Your Grace." Adrian remained motionless as she walked away through the dark corridor. He did not stop her this time. That frightened her more than if he had. The following morning, Ravenmere Hall woke beneath strange, unbearable quiet. Even the servants seemed to sense something fragile had broken overnight. Evelyn spent the day helping Clara with lessons while carefully avoiding every part of the manor where she might accidentally encounter Adrian alone. Yet somehow she still felt him everywhere. In the untouched tea left waiting beside her usual chair. In the extra firewood delivered silently to her room before sunset. In the way the piano did not play that evening for the first time since her arrival. Clara noticed the absence too. "The house sounds sad again," she whispered softly before bedtime. Evelyn forced a faint smile while helping the child beneath the blankets. "Sometimes people become quiet when they are hurting." Clara studied her carefully. "Are you hurting?" Evelyn nearly broke then. Instead, she kissed Clara's forehead gently and dimmed the nursery lamps before retreating alone to her room. Midnight found her seated beside the window with paper spread across the small writing desk, while snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Her suitcase rested half-packed beside the bed once more. This time there would be no storm to stop her. No desperate hand pulling her back from the carriage beneath falling snow. Evelyn dipped the pen carefully into ink before beginning the letter. The words blurred repeatedly through. Tears she refused to let fall. "Your Grace, thank you for allowing me to witness warmth inside Ravenmere Hall again. Clara is stronger than she realizes. And so are you." She paused for a long moment, struggling to steady her trembling hand. Then finally she wrote the words that shattered her completely. "Some people are only meant to pass briefly through another person's life. Perhaps I was one of them." By dawn, the letter remained folded neatly atop her empty teacup downstairs in the entrance hall. Beside it rested Clara's little porcelain deer wrapped carefully in blue ribbon. Mrs. Holloway discovered both shortly after sunrise and immediately covered her mouth in horror. "No," the housekeeper whispered brokenly. "Oh no." Upstairs, Clara's nursery stood empty. Evelyn Harper was gone. Adrian returned to Ravenmere Hall less than an hour later after inspecting storm damage at the Southern Tenant Farms. The moment he stepped inside the manor, he sensed it immediately. The silence. Wrong somehow. Hollow. Mrs. Holloway approached him pale-faced with the folded letter trembling in her hands. Adrian stared at the paper without moving. What is this? But deep down, part of him already knew. His pulse began pounding violently the moment he recognized Evelyn's handwriting. And for the first time in years, Ravenmere Hall no longer felt like a house haunted by old grief. It felt like a tomb all over again. A man can survive grief for years, but losing the person who taught him how to live again will destroy him in a single morning. Adrian stood motionless in the entrance hall long after Mrs. Holloway placed Evelyn's letter into his hands. Snowlight spilled weakly through the tall windows behind him, while the entire manor remained suspended beneath terrible silence. Somewhere upstairs, Clara was crying softly inside the nursery. Adrian could hear every broken sound. Yet for several endless seconds, he could not force himself to unfold the letter. Fear tightened around his chest with brutal clarity, because part of him already understood what waited inside those carefully folded pages. Loss. Again. Finally, his trembling fingers opened the paper. Your Grace, thank you for allowing me to witness warmth inside Ravenmere Hall again. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. The words cut deeper than any accusation ever could have. She was thanking him, leaving gently even now, as though she had never realized she had become the center of his entire world without permission. He continued reading in silence while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Some people are only meant to pass briefly through another person's life. Perhaps I was one of them. The paper nearly slipped from his hand. Something inside him shattered completely then. Not quietly this time. Not elegantly. Adrian pressed one hand against the marble table beside him as breathing suddenly became impossible. Because for the first time in years, he understood the terrible truth grief had hidden from him all along. He had not been mourning Beatrice anymore. He had been hiding behind her memory because loving someone again terrified him more than loneliness ever had. And now Evelyn was gone because he had waited too long to say what mattered. Your Grace. Mrs. Holloway's frightened voice sounded distant somehow. Adrian looked up slowly, his gray eyes dark with devastation. Where did she go? The station road, I believe. One of the stable boys saw her leave before dawn. Adrian moved instantly then. The letter remained crushed tightly in his hand while he crossed the entrance hall with sudden terrifying purpose. Prepare my horse. Mrs. Holloway stared after him in shock. In this weather? But Adrian was already gone. Upstairs, Clara stood silently outside the nursery, clutching her porcelain deer against her chest, while tears slipped quietly down her pale cheeks. Adrian stopped when he saw her. The child looked smaller somehow beneath the endless sadness filling Ravenmere Hall once again. She left because of Lady Rosalind. Clara whispered brokenly. Adrian's entire expression tightened painfully. No, his voice cracked slightly. She left because I was a coward. Clara looked at him through tear-filled gray eyes so painfully similar to his own. Will you bring her back? Adrian stared at the child for one long, aching moment before kneeling slowly in front of her. I am going. To try. Then he rose again and walked directly toward the western wing. The locked room stood waiting at the end of the corridor exactly as it had for years. Frozen in memory. Preserved in grief. Adrian opened the doors wide without hesitation for the first time since Beatrice died. Pale winter light spilled across the abandoned room, while dust trembled softly through the air. The wedding gown remained beside the fireplace. The unopened letters still waited upon the vanity. Everything exactly where sorrow had left it. Adrian crossed the room slowly before stopping beneath Beatrice's portrait. I loved you, he whispered hoarsely. But loving you should never have become a prison sentence for the rest of my life. Silence surrounded him gently, peacefully, and somehow, for the first time in years, the room no longer felt haunted. Adrian removed the black mourning veil draped across the portrait frame and laid it carefully into the fire. Flames consumed the fabric slowly while golden light filled the room once buried beneath shadows. Then he opened every curtain, every shutter. Sunlight flooded the space at last. Downstairs, servants froze in shock as Adrian descended the staircase moments later wearing his dark riding coat, while stable hands hurried desperately through the courtyard outside. Even Lady Rosalind looked startled when he passed through the drawing room without stopping. Adrian, she called after him softly. He paused only briefly near the doorway. I spent 5 years mistaking grief for loyalty, he said quietly. I will not lose her because of it. Something sad but understanding softened Rosalind's expression then. Go, she whispered. Adrian stepped into the freezing morning air moments later, while snow whipped violently across the estate once more. A black horse waited near the gates, already saddled and restless beneath the storm clouds gathering overhead. Adrian mounted quickly, every heartbeat pounding with terrifying urgency now. Because somewhere beyond the snow-covered roads of Ravenmere County, Evelyn Harper still believed she had only ever been temporary. And Adrian Ashbourne intended to spend the rest of his life proving her wrong. Love rarely arrives like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly enough that you only recognize it after it is already holding your entire heart. Snow lashed violently across the roads of Ravenmere County, while Adrian rode through the storm with desperate urgency burning beneath every breath. The black horse pushed forward through nearly 8 inches of fresh snow, while freezing wind tore against Adrian's coat and gloves. He had searched 3 villages already: the station road, the old chapel crossing, the frozen bridge near Hollow Creek. Nothing. No sign of Evelyn. Yet he refused to stop, because for the first time in years, fear no longer came from memory. It came from the possibility of arriving too late. The small church finally appeared just past noon through drifting curtains of white snow near the edge of Blackthorn Village. Adrian recognized the place instantly. A quiet stone chapel where travelers often stopped during storms before continuing toward Boston. His pulse slammed painfully against his ribs as he dismounted beside the iron gate. Then he saw her. Evelyn stood beneath the church awning wrapped in her faded blue coat, while snow gathered softly across the edges of her suitcase near the wooden steps. She looked impossibly small against the endless winter sky. Fragile, as though one more disappointment might finally break her completely. Adrian stopped several feet away, breathing hard from the ride, while snow melted slowly against his dark hair. Evelyn turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. The moment she saw him, every trace of color disappeared from her face. For several endless seconds, neither of them moved. Only the storm spoke between them. "You should not have come in this weather," she whispered finally. Adrian stared at her as though nothing else in the world existed anymore. "You left." The pain inside those 2 words nearly shattered her composure instantly. Evelyn tightened trembling fingers around the handle of her suitcase. "I thought it was best." Adrian crossed the remaining distance between them slowly. "For whom?" Tears burned behind Evelyn's eyes now. "For you." Adrian shook his head once. "No," his voice roughened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You left because I made you believe you were temporary." Snow swirled around them, while church bells rang faintly somewhere beyond the storm. Adrian stepped closer still until only inches remained between them. "Evelyn, look at me." Slowly, painfully, she lifted her eyes toward his. The raw devastation there stole the breath from her lungs. "I spent years convincing myself grief was loyalty," Adrian whispered. "But loving Beatrice was never supposed to mean burying the rest of my life beside her." Evelyn's chest tightened unbearably. Adrian's gaze never left hers. "Then you walked into Ravenmere Hall wearing that worn blue coat with snow in your hair, and somehow the house began breathing again." A tear slipped quietly down Evelyn's cheek. Adrian gently brushed it away with trembling fingers. "Clara laughs because of you. The servants smile because of you." His voice broke slightly. "And I." He stopped briefly, struggling against emotion years of silence had nearly destroyed inside him. "I cannot survive losing you." Evelyn stared at him through blurred vision while the storm softened gradually around them. Adrian, hearing his name on her lips, unraveled the last fragile piece of restraint left inside him. He took both her cold hands carefully into his. "You were never temporary to me." His gray eyes glistened beneath the falling snow now. "I was simply too afraid to admit that you had already become my home." Evelyn broke then. Not loudly, just quietly enough for him to feel the moment her walls finally collapsed. Adrian pulled her gently against him beneath the winter sky, while she buried her face against his chest, trembling with relief and heartbreak and love all at once. He held her as though letting go would destroy him completely. "Come back to Ravenmere," he whispered against her hair. "Stay because you want to. Stay because I love you. Stay because there has never been anyone else I could ever choose after you." Evelyn closed her eyes tightly. For the first time in her life, staying somewhere no longer felt temporary. Weeks later, spring sunlight finally reached Ravenmere Hall. The heavy curtains remained open. Now, fresh flowers filled the corridors once buried beneath dust and silence. Clara's laughter echoed through the gardens while servants smiled openly once more. And in the western wing, the room that once belonged to Grief no longer remained locked. One warm April evening, Adrian stood beside the piano while Evelyn crossed the candlelit music room toward him. He looked at her the same way he always did now, like a man who had once nearly drowned in sorrow and could scarcely believe someone had returned him safely to shore. Outside, winter had finally released Ravenmere Hall at last. But inside the old manor, warmth remained. Not because grief disappeared, because love arrived quietly enough to teach broken hearts how to live again.